may be watching this after it's been recorded. I want to begin not by justifying what I'm not going to speak about today, but I do want to try and explain a little bit to you. My background is as a physiologist who really specialized in endurance sports, cycling, running, swimming. I did a PhD on fatigue and exercise at the limits of human performance and how fatigue was regulated by the brain. So for me to now talk about the specific aspects of gymnastics training and how you need to respond to the COVID-19 lockdown or detraining effect that your athletes will have incurred is a big step across into an area that honestly I'm not that familiar with. And what I've discovered, you discover this very quickly, is I'm not going to pretend to know the challenges that you face. So I'm not going to even try to tell you how to coach gymnastics. I would be pretending and doing you a disservice and myself. So I focus a lot more on principles, and you'll see that in the talk. And in fact, one of my first slides will be on that. So let me get straight into that so that I can speak to you a little bit about the specific content. I just want to find the presentation. So you should all now be able to see a presentation, which I've prepared for this meeting this morning. Hopefully that is all in order and working on your end also. So, right. So to begin with, there is a philosophical underpinning or foundation to the approach that I want to take to the questions that inform this return to training issue. And the first point that I would make is that when we encounter complex problems whose answers are unknown, we have a dilemma. Now, this COVID-19 lockdown and the delay or the detraining that has been forced upon all your athletes as a result of lockdown and the closure of gyms and so on is a problem that no sport and no coaches, no athletes, no scientists have ever really encountered. Of course, we have many instances where athletes get injuries that force them to not train for many months. And so we know how to deal with those situations. But never before on the scale that we've seen, for the time that we've seen, have our training and exercise routines been as disrupted. So the question then is, what should we do? And one of the things to understand is that not everything is knowable. We don't know everything. But what is true is that everything can be understood, in quotation marks, because it's not necessarily fully understandable, but it can be learned to some degree. So what you can do and what I can do as a scientist, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is we can find better ways to learn and better ways to understand so that when we encounter these things that are unknowable, we can do a better job of learning very quickly in order to not make mistakes. So if there's one thing that I want to try and achieve with this presentation, it's to challenge you about how you understand the unknowable in a better, more logical, systematic way. And the key point there is that the process matters much more than the outcome does. So the way you go about learning, the way you go about understanding is going to add more value than simply the actual answer that you get. So here we are on the 17th of June, 2020. I know that you are about to resume your training. Alexis was telling me yesterday, I believe it's Friday, that you'll be able to get back in. So by next week, you'll be asking many of these questions. And they are the following. First of all, how should we return to training? What is our best approach to take these athletes who have had their training disrupted for many months and get them back to training? What informs that is how much general and specific conditioning has been lost. Now, again, I've made this presentation with a focus on gymnastics. I know that many of you are joining from other sports. Thank you for that, by the way. It's great to have you along. But I'm not going to talk much about those general and specific conditioning elements because it would not be in my interests or yours for me to try and speak outside my field. But that is a question that you will have to address, is how much has that athlete moved from point A to point B, and then how quickly can we get them back to point A upon return? And the thing that really informs that is what is the shortest time in which we can achieve this without trading it for excessive injury risks. And the concept that we'll talk about later to end off with is that there's a trade-off, and you can get there quicker, but you trade that speed for risk of injury. And that's the line that you have to walk. And then finally, if you think about this as navigating through an unknown territory, at any given time, how will you know if you're in the best possible place? Those are, in my opinion, the 5 important questions that you have to ask yourself at this time. Now, none of those questions have an answer that I can tell you. I wish that I could tell you that your athletes have lost 25%. I wish I could tell you that it'll take them 8 weeks or 12 weeks to get back. I wish I could tell you exactly how much to do before you injure your athletes. But I can't do that. Nobody can. The whole challenge here is that we're dealing with a novel situation that no one has really ever seen before. But what I can support you, hopefully, with and challenge you to do is understand how the scientific approach can be applied to performance. Now, very quickly on this, my big passion is trying to link coaches to scientists. And what I've discovered is that the very best coaches are better than most of the scientists that I've met at doing this. And so I don't know, I'm assuming most of you are coaches, more on that spectrum, that end of the spectrum, and not the scientists. I know that there's often not necessarily tension, but just misalignment between what the coach thinks should be done and how the scientist thinks it should be done. In my experience, those things complement each other very well, and I want to explain to you why. This here is the scientific process. It is the thing that informs research studies. It is the process by which scientists ask questions, develop hypotheses, conduct experiments, analyze data, and then conclude. And it just keeps going over and over with reflection and rethinking in the middle. So the process basically is, can I ask good questions? Do I know how and where to find the answers? Do I have the capacity to measure? And measurement means different things, which we'll see. Do I interpret the answers that I get through measurement in the correct way? And do I then report and communicate what it means? So if we go again from the top, for coaches, what that means is understanding what are the elements that matter to performance. It means understanding what happens if I do something. So if I introduce a training stimulus, or if I change the routine, or if I modify the sequence or the microcycle, the mesocycle, what will happen? Those are the questions a coach asks. Then they need to know where and how to find the answers, which means that they have to have the ability to control the circumstances, and they have to have minimal bias. That's what good measurement or good design of a study looks like. And that process is always hypothesis driven. Now, as coaches, you might not necessarily understand that you are managing and working on the basis of a hypothesis, but you are. The sports that I've been involved with involve team selection. When I select a team to play a rugby match, I'm making a hypothesis. I'm saying that if I pick that player, it will help my team win in that match. That's a hypothesis which you then go about measuring after the fact. The next thing that you are going to do, once you know your hypothesis, is measurement. Do you have a reliable and accurate way to measure what you think matters? And are you systematic in that approach? Oftentimes, the mistake that science makes is it forces measurement that is irrelevant. It's measurement for the sake of measurement. And that measurement doesn't have a high predictive value. It produces false negatives and false positives, and it's random and haphazard. That's when coaches get annoyed. And so what you need to do as coaches is own the measurement. Now, sometimes measurement is visual. We watch the athlete and we see. And your experience as coaches allows you to do that successfully. But it's still measurement. You just might not think of it in that way. Then we need to interpret our answers. That's insight and uncertainty and understanding. Why did we not find something? Why did we find something? And then finally, we report. Now, the point I want to make, and then I'm going to go into the specifics, and I'm sorry if I've labored this, but I believe it's important. The point I want to make is that this process running down here from top to bottom is the same thing that good coaches do all the time. So the best coaches are doing this. They might not necessarily write it down and make graphs out of it and treat it like a scientific experiment, but they are doing these things all the time. So the challenge then that I want to lay down right up front is, are you as a coach prepared to run this process, these 5 things: questions, knowing how to find answers, measure, interpret, report? Because if you're willing to do that over the course of the next 4, 8, 12 weeks, then whatever things you don't know, like these questions we begin with, are answerable because you'll have understood. So that's the key point, okay? So with that in mind, let's understand some of the principles that will inform how you approach this in the next few weeks, particularly early on, because I think you can set the trend, you can get the ball rolling in the right direction from the beginning. So when we talk about detraining, we're talking about physiology running backwards. So the training stimulus that you normally expose your athletes to causes adaptations in a direction of performance. When we remove the training stimulus, those adaptations reverse in the direction of no performance or less performance. And so, for example, this is cardiovascular adaptation to the heat. I did tell you that this is where my bias exists. So in cardiovascular adaptations to the heat, your adaptation improves your performance by adapting you. So for instance, plasma volume improves. As a consequence, heart rate drops. Thermal comfort gets better as we adapt. The problem then, if we take that heat stimulus away, is that basically we start to read this thing from right to left. So whatever increases in plasma volume have occurred now drop off. Whatever increases in thermal comfort we've achieved now return to normal. And our heart rate goes back to where it was. So effectively the graph looks like this. Now the same thing that I've shown here for the cardiovascular adaptations to the heat exists for pretty much every other system. So this is from a very comprehensive review article by Inigo Mujica and Padilla, in which they document the following cardiovascular changes. So pretty much everything that makes a good athlete decreases, and the things that and the opposite happens for the things like heart rate, maximal heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. We see the same similar, at least, characteristics for metabolic systems. So we see changes that go in the direction of an unadapted athlete, and we see the same for neuromuscular characteristics. So, and again, your athletes are perhaps less reliant on the cardiovascular or some of the cardiovascular system attributes shown here, and more on the neuromuscular. But they're not unreliant on cardiovascular, because if you think about their ability to recover from training stimulus, that's a function of cardiovascular and metabolic fitness, quote unquote, which they will have lost. And so the same training load that would have been manageable prior to lockdown is no longer there. So you have to manage all these things with the realization that the post-lockdown athlete is a different athlete to the pre-lockdown athlete. That's reality, and you have to guide them back to where they were before. Their readiness to train will be significantly compromised, a degree to which will depend on what they've been able to do in lockdown. And that will maybe be one of the first things that requires assessments. I know that all of you have been in touch with your athletes during this time, and so you will have some idea, but that really is your start point, is how ready is this athlete to train. What it does is it renders performance almost irrelevant at this time, and therefore it creates a set of injury risks that you have to try and navigate. So those are some of the things we need to talk about here. So the first question is, how far does physiology reverse when we remove any training stimulus? This is a study that was done in a German university in support of the International Space Station. So as you would know, what happens here is they send these astronauts into space, and while they're up there for months at a time, they have no gravity and there's no stimulus at all. So what Kramer et al. Did in 2017 was they took a group of healthy men and they basically forced them into bed rest for 60 days, which is astonishing. I can't imagine being a participant in this study. So you have basically an assessment before, then they have, in their instance, their detraining period is 60 days of no physical activity at all, and then they test them afterwards. Now, I'm showing you this because I think this sets the absolute baseline for what happens to healthy people when they don't train. What they found is pretty much everything declining, some of it significantly. So bone mineral density drops by 2.5%, which is surprisingly small actually, but nevertheless a significant drop. The lean mass of the leg drops by 5%. Naturally, strength goes down considerably, 41% drop in knee extension and a 16% drop in knee flexion. The VO2 max, which as you know is the cardiovascular capacity or engine, is down almost 30%, and so is the peak power output. So not surprisingly, forced rest, forced inactivity causes an enormous detraining effect with large functional losses, structural regression because you see bone and muscle mass, morphology literally changes, and a host of associated negative changes. Now, in general, it's been documented that we lose about 2 to 3% of our functional losses per week. So a 10 to 12 week layoff would cause around a 30% drop in most physiological systems. Some will be much larger than that, depending on where on the spectrum it lies and depending on the athlete. And so that's an important consideration. It also depends on what the athlete has been able to do during the time that they've been away. So here is a study that was published in 2009. It was on elite kayakers in Spain. And what they did was after their competitive season, they gave half their kayakers 5 weeks of no training at all. So they were completely detrained. And the other half of their kayakers were given 3 strength sessions and 10 to, let me try that again. They gave them 5 weeks of either no training or reduced training. So they were split into 2 groups, no training or reduced training. The group that got reduced training was given 1 strength session and 2 endurance sessions per week, compared to their normal, which consisted of 3 strength and between 10 and 15 kayaking sessions per week. So they go from what is basically 10 to 12 hours a week of training down to about 2 or 3 hours a week of training. And the other group, of course, gets nothing at all. So this is a study to see how little you can get away with before you actually start to see losses. And here's the finding. So for VO2 max, the group that does no training sees an 11.3% reduction in its VO2 max over 5 weeks of nothing. The group that trains 3 times a week sees a 5.6. So in other words, even the small amounts of training, and you compare that, it's literally 20% of what they normally do, cuts the loss in half. Paddling power output drops by, call it 8% in the group that does nothing, and it drops by 4% in the group that paddles even twice per week. So again, 20% of the training causes half the losses to be reversed. We see a similar thing when it comes to their strength outputs. This is bench press and bench pull. So bench press is down by 9%. When you train even 1 strength session per week, it's down by 4%. Bench pull, down by almost 8%. 1 session per week, down by 3.4%. And so the take-home message from this particular study is that a little, and in this case, as I said, it's 20% of what they normally do, goes a long way towards defending those losses. So whatever your athletes have been able to do during lockdown will have reduced the detraining effect, which in turn allows you to recover and to regain that training effect during retraining much more effectively. The same thing from that previous study, which I told you about, the astronaut preparation study. Remember I told you that they had a group of men do 60 days of bed rest. What they then did was half of those men, literally for 3 minutes a day, 6 days a week, did hopping exercises. And here you see the blue line shows you the jumping group and the orange line is the control. So bone mineral density in the tibia stays the same with hopping, it drops without. Same thing here at the top end of the tibia, it stays the same with hopping, it drops without. So the point here is that even a tiny, tiny stimulus, in this case 3 minutes a day for 6 days a week is enough to defend bone mineral density. This is lean mass. The orange is the group that stays in bed. The blue is the group that hops. You can see the difference that that hopping made. Leg strength, 41% lower with bed rest, only 3% lower with hopping. VO2 max, 29% versus 5%. Peak power, 29% loss versus 12%. Now, these are not athletes, so we would not expect an athlete who is accustomed to a stimulus here to see the same benefit from such a small 3 minutes a day stimulus. But the point is, once again, that the detraining effect is significantly reduced by even small volumes of training. So the work that you have done with your athletes during lockdown is not in vain, is what I'm getting at here. And when you are able to resume with them, you will see the benefit of that. And so the first thing, again, from a practical application perspective, is to understand what they've done and how it's benefited them, because that will then change what you try to do next. So this training during lockdown modulates where the athlete may be. A couple of points here about what Isserin has called training residuals. This is from a paper that Isserin had published in 2010, in which he really talked about periodization, and then in the context of block periodization spoke about these training residuals. And he identifies 5 factors that affect how long a training benefit or adaptation will last. That's what a residual means. And so the first of those is the duration of training before cessation. So the longer your athlete has been training before they stop, the longer their training benefit will last. That makes experience. That makes sense, because you've had this experience and this chance to embed those adaptations. The load concentration level before training cessation. Highly concentrated training will cause shorter residuals. So that's related to the first one. The age and duration of the sport of the athletes. So in this instance, older and more experienced athletes tend to have longer residuals. You, of course, work with younger and in many instances less experienced athletes. So there's a balance that you have to find there for yours. The character of preparation, and then finally the biological nature of the developing ability. So when an ability is associated with morphological and biochemical changes like enzymes, like muscle mass, like bone mineral density, then they tend to have longer residuals, whereas the anaerobic glycolytic abilities tend to have shorter residuals. So bear that in mind also. The point about this is that Isserin wasn't making this for a detraining argument necessarily. It was more a theoretical model aimed at informing how you apply loads during block periodization. So it is theoretical, and it's not necessarily relevant to the situation you now find yourselves in, but it's worth bearing in mind those 5 factors which will influence where your athletes return. And so the conclusion that he makes in that paper is that the prediction, evaluation, and programming of cumulative and residual training effects is meaningful and indispensable components of block periodization. So, now that we've sort of established the principle, we understand that detraining causes a loss of physiological function, some more than others. We know that whatever your athletes have been able to do during lockdown periods will have significantly changed the magnitude or the scale of that detraining. The next thing is, how quickly do we regain that training ability? Now, I was not able to find studies on adolescent or pre-adolescent athletes, not even necessarily on young athletes. And I contemplated taking this out, but I decided I'm going to include it because there are 2 studies that have been done in older men. And they show the same thing, and I think it's relevant in the sense that younger athletes will achieve at least the same responses, if not larger. So I'm showing this almost as a baseline or a benchmark, and I think that you can expect your athletes to return even faster than this. So here's a study that Henwood et al. Did, where they did 6 months of training, followed by 6 months of detraining, and then they retrained for 12 weeks, so 3 months. What they found is that during that 24-week detraining period, these older men lost 17% of their muscle strength. When they came back, within 12 weeks of retraining, they gained back all the losses. So in other words, they gained back 21% compared to a loss of 17%. And so what we see then is a modest reduction in strength with detraining and the recovery of that loss within 12 weeks of retraining. So 24 weeks to lose, 12 weeks to recover. A similar study that was done, published earlier this year, they had a 12-week training period where they gained 36% strength. They then had a 12-week detraining period where they lost 14% of strength, followed by a 12-week retraining period where they gained back 24%. And you'll see here that the detraining causes only a partial loss of strength. But then when they retrain, within basically 6 weeks, they get back to where they were to begin with. So that's the same finding as this side. It took 12 weeks to lose it. It takes 6 weeks to get it back. So the rule of thumb, and again, I'm not massively fond of rule of thumbs because every athlete is individual and that's your job, is to understand that, is that it takes about 1 week to regain condition, specific conditioning, in this case strength, for every 2 weeks that we have off. The same is true for cardiovascular parameters like VO2 max, by the way. So a 10-week break, you could start with the expectation that it's going to take 5 weeks to regain that functional performance and physiology. That period might be lower, or shorter rather, when the training is not reduced to zero, which again comes back to what was done during lockdown. And it might be shorter for younger athletes. Again, I can't stress, I've shown you these studies in older men with the expectation, or rather the hypothesis, that it's probably even quicker in younger athletes. Then again, in younger athletes, those training residuals, as per Isserin, might be shorter. You might have achieved more losses, which means you might need to allow more. This is why it's unknowable, and we have to be systematic in our approach. So the return to training, the promising news, at least from this study, is that the return to training and the return to functional fitness is relatively quick compared to how it's lost. So that's good news and encouraging. The danger, the single biggest danger, and there's evidence now, it's been documented in German football, which returned, as you know, in the middle of May. It's been reported anecdotally, I know, from swimming in Australia, is that when these athletes get back to training, the risk of injury is significantly higher. And it's significantly higher in some interesting ways, because it makes you reassess potentially who is vulnerable to injury. And I want to share with you this study. It was published in 2011, and it was on the NFL because they had a unique situation, I guess a little bit similar to lockdown in 2011, where there was a lockout as a consequence of a strike. And the result of that is that for this period you see on the bottom, from early in March all the way to late in July, players were unable to train. They were unable to see their normal medical and strength and conditioning staff and coaches. What they found is that in the month and a half that they were able to return, they were forced into a very short preseason before the season began. They found that there were 12 Achilles tendon ruptures in that month and bit period that they had as a preseason in 2011. So 12, what does that mean? This panel at the top shows you the typical number of Achilles tendon ruptures over a 5-year period. And what you will see is that on average, the normal expected number is around 5 Achilles tendon ruptures per season, from the preseason, in which there were 2, and the regular season, in which there were 3. Subsequently, I think it was in 2008, they found that there were 8 Achilles tendon ruptures. So the number of Achilles tendon injuries is significant, but it was between, say, let's say 5 and 8 per year. So therefore, this batch of 12 Achilles tendon ruptures that happened during this shortened preseason is significant. And even more noteworthy is that 10 of these Achilles tendon ruptures happened within the first 2 weeks of coming back after the lockout period. Now, an Achilles tendon obviously is a big deal injury. It's potentially career-ending or limiting for the athlete. So that is particularly severe. What is most interesting about that is that Achilles tendon injuries are often thought to be old athlete injuries. They tend to happen to older athletes who've had more years of playing. And that is indeed the case. So when we look at the typical picture up top here, we find that the average person or the average player who ruptures their Achilles has had 6 years in the NFL. In 2011, this batch of 12, the average was 1.4 years, and 5 of those 12 happened to first-year players who'd only just been drafted a few months before. So the whole picture of who's more at risk of this injury changes. It goes from being an older, experienced athlete injury to being a younger, inexperienced athlete. Same thing for player age. The average age typically of an athlete, a player who ruptures the tendon, is 29, which is 2.5 years older than the NFL's average. In this particular season, it was 23. So the point that I'm trying to make is not only is the risk of this particular injury higher, because that by itself is a concern, but it also seems to potentially change who is at risk. So your assessment of your athletes' risk profiles might alter as a consequence of lockdown. Now, in this particular instance, the theories were that the degree of lockout was a significant factor. Obviously, being younger made these athletes more likely to sustain Achilles tendon injuries, being less experienced, which of course is linked to age, less training history, and also just familiarity with how to prepare themselves. So the theory was that the older player who's gone through 4 or 5 preseasons in their life is more familiar with what it takes to recondition. So once removed from their normal stimulus, the facilities, the coaches, the medical staff, they are still able to do something, whereas the rookie has no idea. And so he makes the mistakes that then make him vulnerable to this particular injury risk. And so the key point, I think, for you, the questions that need to be asked are the following. As coaches, you all understand your sports injury profile and risk factors. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on that in a moment. But I think you know more or less when is a gymnast likely to be injured, which gymnast is vulnerable to which injuries, which apparatus is likely to cause injuries. You know this. But there's a possibility, as shown by the NFL, that lockdown changes that injury profile. And it creates a new set of risks that you wouldn't normally consider, and it creates a new vulnerable population. So it might be that the athletes that you normally think are safest become medium or even high risk, as happened for those younger players in the NFL. And it's not necessarily about the Achilles tendon, because I know that might not be one of the injuries that you see most commonly, but it could be others. And you need to think about how lockdown and the detraining might have changed that risk profile. So the first step really is to understand injury risk. I'm going to go through this quickly on the assumption that most of you already know these things. But it's been documented in a number of studies now, the various elements of injury risk in gymnastics. So we know that the injury incidence is between 1 and 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of exposure, which equates to about between 2 and 8.5 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. What that number allows you to do, and this is where I would use this, is come up almost with an expectation for how many injuries you would encounter in a group of gymnasts per year. So for instance, based on this 2 to 8.5, if you had a group of 10 gymnasts, you would expect between 20 and 30 injuries per year if they trained with you almost every day of the week, 6 days a week. So that almost sets a bar. So 20 to 30 injuries per year in a group of 10 gymnasts. So can you use that to identify if things are not going well? Possibly. We'll come back to that. In terms of injury nature, it's been documented that between 50% and 80% of gymnastics injuries occur suddenly or acute, and 20 to 50% are more gradual or chronic. What is interesting is that the elite gymnast is more likely to be a gradual or chronic injury, up to 60% in some studies that I was able to find. Injury location for women and men is different, largely as a consequence of different apparatus that are used. So in women, it's lower body, upper body, back and spine. In men, it's largely upper body, lower body, back and spine, particularly shoulders and wrists for the men. The situation, this is an important one for coaches. It's a challenge for us in rugby. We know that the risk of injury is much higher in competition. In gymnastics, it's 3 times higher when you compete than when you train. But between 80 and 97% of all injuries happen in training because it's so much more of our exposure volume. So if an athlete is exposed to, let's say, for argument's sake, 800 hours a year of training time, 99% of that is possibly in training time. And so the element that is manageable for you as coaches is the one responsible for most injuries. And that gives you a large degree of influence over these injuries. They're not in competitions. Timing-wise, some interesting things. It's been found in a couple of studies that injuries are more likely to occur early during practice. And it's been theorized that that's possibly the result of inadequate warm-up or too aggressive a warm-up for the subsequent training session. In other words, the warm-up is too challenging and does not allow for progression in skill, execution, and also obviously the structural muscular preparation for work. So it is interesting to consider whether the tempo and the progressions in your training session may need to be modified, particularly now when the risk of injury might be a little higher than it would normally be at baseline. And then finally, the time of year. It's been shown that there's more risk of injury early during seasons. Similar in nature, I guess, to what the NFL found, is that there's a period after a break where the athlete is detrained and that injury risk is higher. Now, the whole point of me talking to you this morning is to reinforce that. So we already know that one. Let's just go very quickly and try and find some practical applications. If you know that in a group of 10 gymnasts, there's going to be 20 to 30 injuries per year, it allows you to benchmark and set almost an expectation. Because what that means is that you'd have 2.5 injuries per month for 10 athletes. So if you've got a squad of 10 athletes, you could expect 2 to 3 injuries in that month. If you see 4 in your first month, you have a problem. If you've got 20 athletes, you would expect to see 4 to 5 injuries. If you see 7 or 8, it means you have a problem. So in effect, what I'm saying here is that you can use this number to almost put in place an expectation that then serves as an early warning system to you that you might be going a little bit far. You should not be seeing more injuries than normal over the next 4 to 8 weeks, and that might give you an expectation. That is a global injury incidence, by the way. You may very well know your own numbers, in which case use your own numbers. They'll be more reliable as a comparison. For the nature of injury, what I would take from this is that if 20 to 50% of injuries are gradual, it means that almost half of the injuries that force your athletes into medical care are preventable through load management. Because those injuries are not accidental, they're a consequence of the chronic over-application of load to which the athlete does not adapt. And that's something you can manage if you measure the load in a systematic, accurate way. So you need to think about that. Because if you do that, then what I've spoken about before becomes less a problem. You won't see the injuries. The third one is the location of injuries. And again, this is really a technical element. If you know which apparatus are likely to cause injuries, you know that it's different for men and women on that basis, then you can manage the introduction of those stimuli gradually and with a degree of caution to avoid those injuries. Situation, same thing, load management. Training is responsible for the vast majority of injuries, and it's as a consequence of the load that we apply to the athlete. It's almost like the dose of medicine we give our athletes. You can change that dosage if you manage and get feedback on the load. The timing, some considerations here would be to change your warm-up procedure, the grading of your progressions during sessions, and then fatigue management. I understand why coaches would want to introduce high intensity, more technical things early. It happens in rugby as well, but they are potentially more injurious. The counterpoint to that, by the way, is that if you put those very demanding exercises and activities at the end of training, then you're doing them in a position of fatigue, which could also be risky. So you have to manage the timing of when you introduce your highest risk activities. You know what they are, I don't, but that's really the message is, and the principle is to do the highest risk activities when the athlete is neither fatigued, but has to be properly warmed up, because the evidence suggests that that's sometimes done wrong, possibly in the early direction. And then time of year, you know this. I'm not even going to comment on that. You already knew that. It's why we're here. So how do we then offset that? This is a man by the name of Peter Drucker, who's written a number of management books. He has nothing to do at all with sport. He has everything to do with business management and leadership. And his famous quote is that you can't manage what you don't measure. Now, I know and understand that this is one area where there's often tension between scientists and coaches, because scientists love to measure things. Sometimes they measure too many things that don't give value to the coach, and it takes a lot of time and energy. So we have to find a balance here. But the principle is that if you don't measure something, how do you manage it? And so we know, for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples. We know that the best predictor of an injury is a previous injury. So the simplest and most effective things that you can do as a coach is to fully understand your athlete's injury history and to document that. I understand that as coaches, you work very closely with your athletes, you have close relationships with them. So you may know that athlete 1 has a history of ankle ligament instability. You may know that athlete 2 has a shoulder instability or weakness. I get that you know those things, but the systematic process of documenting those injuries will go a long way towards improving how you manage them. So that's a simple exercise that I think will produce large benefits for you, purely because the process of knowing improves the process of action. And then the question for you, and I did touch on this previously, is how do we calibrate the dosage of our training and recovery? You know, one of the coaches that I work with used to say that training is a vaccine. He used to call it a vaccine. And he was aware that if he gave too much of that vaccine, too large a dose, that he would actually cause the thing he was trying to avoid. And that's the question for you, is how do you calibrate the dosage of training and recovery? Can we, or you, put in place early detection systems to identify problems before they become too large to solve? And the answer is, of course, you can. Because if you're on top of it, and if you're measuring things, and you're monitoring regularly, and you're understanding, is this athlete adapting? That's your early detection system. So at the risk of not saying, told you so, but there's been this movement to monitor and measure and document how athletes are adapting, measuring their load. You know, how many minutes did they train and what was their perception of effort? That's a basic measurement, but it's been shown, or suggested anyway, to have large benefits for the prevention of injuries. Because if you don't monitor that load, then you are unable to learn and you're unable to adapt. And so it's very important to ask those questions. Athlete response monitoring. Is the athlete reporting higher than usual pain scores the day after training sessions? Are they reporting to training with muscle stiffness and soreness? That stiffness and soreness in and of itself may not be an issue, but it's a symptom of incomplete recovery from the previous day. And if it's happening there, then it could be happening in the ligament that you know is vulnerable to injury. And so the regular asking and assessment of the athlete's response is a reliable early detection system that you can use to then change the dosage of your training. Injury and pain, as I mentioned, you might consider, because I know this is the case certainly in athletes, they don't want to be deselected, they don't want to be away from the training groups, they don't want to be away from the coach and the training stimulus. And so they tend not to report injuries. And I suspect that that might be even more the case in the athletes that you work with. Is it possible that for this period of high risk over the next 4 to 8 weeks, you actually set up something where they can report that independent? Would that help? I don't know, but that's something you might consider. And then training diaries where you reflect on the training sessions that have been done. And that's for both the athletes and the coaches. Again, I understand there's a time and an energy cost to that, and you may not necessarily see the value. There is value. And that value is particularly great now in this period of high vulnerability as we move into retraining our athletes. So I want to close off on this slide. It is my last concept that I want to share with you, is this idea that basically what you're managing over the course of the next 4, 8, 12, 24 weeks into next year, your return to competition, is periodization, but with unique challenges. And the trajectory that you intend to take your athlete, the journey that they will travel with you, produces a number of trade-offs, the main one being injury versus performance. So this is almost a conclusion to what I've spoken to you about. On the y-axis, we have the performance requirements. Now, those performance requirements are unique to every sport. If this was a marathon runner, I'd be assessing VO2 max, running economy, and lactate threshold. If it was a rugby player, I'd be measuring bench press, bench pull, etc. You've got your own set of those things for gymnastics. You know what goes into a good gymnastic performance. That's the start point. You need to understand what matters for performance. The power, the strength, the ability to execute skills, fatigue resistance, I didn't put up, proprioception, and then mass or body composition. Those are all elements that will change over the course of the next 8 to 12 weeks as you get your athletes back into full training. The question you have to ask is that performance requirement measurable? Some of them are, some of them are not. Mass is easy to do. Proprioception may be less so, but it's observable. So there's different elements of measurement. The next thing is, should you measure it? Because just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And that's really important. You have to understand what are the downsides of measurement. And so if you're going to say, yes, I should measure it, the next thing is how often. Should I measure it once a month, or should I measure it weekly, or should I measure it once every 6 months? Those are key questions for you to understand because they will inform what you do next. And the first thing that you would have to know is if that was my athlete before lockdown, this might be my athlete after lockdown. In other words, whatever it is, whether it's power or strength or skill or execution, okay, in the case of mass, it probably goes the other way, right? They may have gained mass or whatever, but let's talk about positive to negative or negative to positive here. The question is that and this is the one we can't answer, is we don't know the size of that reduction. We don't know whether your athletes have lost 15 or 30 or 45%. And that's important, but at the same time, it almost doesn't really matter for the next thing you have to do, because the next thing that you have to do is you have to understand where that athlete is. And that involves what we could call baseline testing. Now, some of your athletes have already got baseline testing from lockdown, before lockdown. So in a sense, you've got a nice comparison. Some of you don't have that, but that's fine. It doesn't really matter. I think the thing that I would challenge you to ask is baseline testing worth doing? Now, in some instances, it definitely is. In other instances, it might not be. It might not be because sometimes those measurements don't have high predictive value. Sometimes those measurements don't have high sensitivity. If you've got the ability to measure something, but it doesn't predict performance, and it often throws up false results, that measurement is a waste of time. Don't even bother doing it, because these measurements are not benign. You've got to think about the cost of that measurement. There's a time cost. Sometimes there's a financial cost, not always, but there's also an emotional or psychic cost of doing testing on athletes that you know will underperform. You don't need to measure the athlete to know that they may be different to before lockdown. You already know that. So it might be worth actually giving them a week or two just to get their basic level of performance back and then measure. Or you might decide to measure it now, which is fine. I'm not telling you which one to do, but what I am cautioning you against is just measuring for the sake of measuring when you know that if you over measure, you might actually negatively affect your athlete. I mean, is there anything to be gained from proving that the athlete is weak at this point in time? Or would you be better placed waiting a couple of weeks when they're not quite as bad so that you've got a positive emotional result from testing? So those are the kinds of trade-offs that you need to think about in terms of training, in terms of in this case, testing. What you're doing next is you're saying, right, this is now we're basically periodizing. This is your job as coaches, and you know how to do this. You're working backwards from an endpoint. Now, the question then is that endpoint March next year, which is when you've been told to aim for return to competition? Or do you want to move that endpoint earlier? Maybe you want to make it November and get them into a training camp. And here, you've got to start thinking about the psychology of that athlete also. March is a long way away. I mean, it's 9-10 months away. If I'm correct, it's July, August, September, October, November, December, January, March. 8 months to go. That might be so far in the horizon your athletes have had their season disrupted. They could be a little bit negative, a little bit depressed. It might be that you want to move that forward. Irrespective of what your target is, your job is to manage the trajectory. Now, there are various ways to get from point A over here to point B over here. You can take them up aggressively and then level off, or you could, and so this is a rapid regain of conditioning. It leaves you with more time to develop execution and specific conditioning, but there's naturally a greater injury risk. We've discussed that. The converse to that is this one here, where you have a more gradual regain. You reduce the acute load in this early phase, but you reduce skill acquisition time and you have to accelerate it later on. Now, because this is a 9-month period, these are oversimplistic. I understand that. That's not how periodization would work in terms of the performance requirements. So what's more likely to happen is this very dynamic, fluid situation where you might start slowly, then accelerate, and then slow it down. One of the things that I think is interesting is because everyone's worried correctly about the next sort of 6 to 10 weeks worth of training time. How do we get our athletes back? I think it's also worth thinking about what's over the horizon, because maybe we can see the next sort of 8 to 10 weeks, but we can't necessarily see beyond that. The point I would make is that if you get your athletes back to their pre-lockdown condition within the next, say, 12 to 16 weeks, and I'm being conservative there, let's say it's 12 weeks, that's 3 months. You've got another 6 months before competition. So now you've got to ask yourself, what do I do for the next 6 months? Do I maintain that peak because I'm not planning to have an off season, or should I actually plan for an off season? So you might actually plan to divide the next 9 months up into a period of regain, then detraining again before you rebuild. So there are a number of questions that you have to ask. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is don't limit your horizons really to this next 6 to 10 weeks, when you might actually need to think about what happens beyond that in order to inform your 2021 seasons. So that's really a summary of this presentation. It's, do you understand what performance requires? Are you measuring the right things at the right times? And then how are you going to manage and monitor this trajectory from where they are today to where they are when you need them to be at some point in the future? And so in conclusion then, what is not knowable is quote unquote measurable. It doesn't mean scientific measurement of lactates and heart rates and all. Sometimes it's visual, but it's still measurable as long as you are systematic about it. So it's important that you're as systematic as possible. It may seem onerous, it may seem like a chore, it may seem unnecessarily time consuming, but the value is in the process. Then that process is applied to injury history. The most basic thing you can do is to write down what each athlete's injury history was, because it is a strong predictor of what might happen next. Their training load and the athlete responses, their injury expectations, which is again, you formulating hypothesis saying, I'm going to have 2 injuries a month. If I have 4, then I need to adjust something. So that's an experiment that you're running. And then finally, testing and assessment with a degree of caution. So that is, as I mentioned to you up front, almost necessarily high level. And I would love to have been able to give you more definitive answers, but I can't. But I can give you the definitive reality that as coaches, working together, many of you with doctors and scientists and other strength and conditioning experts, you have the ability to ask good questions and to measure things that will make the unknowable more understood. And so hopefully that gives you something to take away. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you. I see there were some things coming into the chat as I was going, and I'm going to ask Alexis to now just take over on the management of those questions. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Ross. Thanks for unmuting me also. I know at Singapore Gymnastics we've been talking a lot about a question that Derek May from the Yard has also got, which is a concern with girls between 11 and 16 years old, particularly in relation to hormones and growth spurts that might have changed due to detraining. The question is, should there be any special care towards this age group? And I guess if so, what?
Yeah, the what is obviously much more difficult. I mean, the simple, almost trite answer is yes, because when you work with particularly vulnerable populations, and that's a very valid concern, I think you have an obligation to do them that service of being excessively conservative, and that does mean that you would have to take some degree of special care. Now, I'm not an expert in that world of biological development through puberty and adolescence, so I wouldn't even necessarily know who the best person or expert to talk to about that would be. I suppose part of it will be dealt with when these athletes return to you and you're able to assess them. Now, over 10 to 12 weeks, could significant changes have happened in that time? Yes, they could in that group. I mean, that's documented. And then could the reintroduction of a training stress that is much larger affect them moving forward? Yes, as well. So it could very well be worth working, particularly the athletes you think are vulnerable, with a doctor to actually assess that. I'd be guessing if I said what hormone levels and so forth you would want to monitor and measure on them. I'm not sure you necessarily need to do that. I think you can measure it or you can assess it at the outcome side, not so much the input, i.e. hormonal side of that group. But I think that if you monitor and measure that group particularly closely during the first 4 to 8 weeks, you'd probably pick up anything that's going on there. And then if you have medical experts on standby that you can take them to, you'll probably deal with the 20% who do require that specific care. That's a grossly unsatisfactory answer, I think. That's about the best that I can offer there.
It's yes, related to finding out what you can, so being informed and measuring what you can, I guess. So another question from our WAG National Training Centre head coach, which is about gymnastics load. So specifically the forces that act on tendons, ligaments, and bone density during rebound and landing. So how long do you think it'll take to get back to the old level of loading, specifically with regard to alternating between load and recovery?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think that you probably have to treat every returning athlete as a severe injury and then manage their return to play, as it were, with some sort of gradual progression program where you assess that and you take them as far as you think they can go and then bring them back down. I mean, this is the basic concept, I guess, of all coaching. It's that dose. You know, as I mentioned, I used the analogy of a vaccine. You give them the vaccine and you see if it creates immunity to the next level of load, and so on and so on and so on. So it's you as coaches will all have had some experience in working with athletes who are returning from injury. Let's say it's a ligament injury, and you understand how you measure and adjust and assess that response of that previously injured ligament to load. I think that's the principle that you have to use here. Quite what that looks like for gymnastics, again, it would be fascinating to work with you, you know, on the floor, as it were, to try and understand that. But the question I'd ask is, if an athlete is vulnerable to injury, does that injury always occur suddenly, or is there some warning sign of that injury? If there's a warning sign, you can detect that. And so if you're overloading them in the first sort of 3 to 4 weeks now upon return, they will be able to report actually that this feels larger than their body is capable of dealing with. On the other hand, what would be worse, the worst case scenario is if there's no indication of it at all and you just get these sudden acute injuries, in which case your first sign of overloading them will be an injury, and that would be a failure. So it's obviously a very difficult question. As for how long it would take, the rule of thumb I mentioned there was 1 week for every 2 weeks. These are obviously very specific heavy loads that you've mentioned and brought up. So perhaps you need to go to 1-to-1, and you need to start with the expectation that it's going to take 12 weeks, because that's the period of which you had no access to those kinds of loads. It's going to take 12 weeks to get them back to where they were. And if they are faster than that, you'll be surprised, but that would maybe be your expectation to begin with.
All right. There's another question in terms of testing, what would your recommendation be in terms of the frequency?
So that depends very much on which trajectory you're on, because if you're improving quickly, you test more often. If you're improving slowly, you test less often, obviously, because there's no need to test when your improvements are more gradual. So I would say that it depends on your expectation for what that athlete is trying to achieve and what sort of trajectory they're onto. Different tests would require different measurements. For instance, I don't think that there's a large requirement at this point to test for body composition regularly. I think you know that body composition may have changed. So it might be an initial assessment or an assessment delayed by a couple of weeks and then something a little bit less frequent. Whereas, and again, I don't know what the specific tests are, which makes it difficult to answer that question specifically. But I would only be testing if I have a feeling that the performance in that test will have changed. In other words, if I don't believe there to have been a change, then I wouldn't go through the process of testing them. So rapid improvement, test more often, gradual improvement, less often. Once a month probably is where you need to be for the next 3 to 4 months for most of those tests, in my opinion. But some of them you might do weekly because they might be good tests to give you an indication of whether the athlete is adapting. So again, it comes back to right now, what's your main concern or priority? Is my gymnast adapting to the load? So therefore, what is the test that I can do weekly to answer that question? That's the fundamental thing you have to ask at this point.
Okay. Maybe one last question, unless someone else jumps in before we finish this. How do we know if we're progressing things too slowly?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there is no real way to know that independent of knowing what the target point is, right? Because the only criteria by which something would be too slow, well, there's two, I think. One is that the athlete is bored, which is relevant, I think. And number two is that the competition is approaching you faster than you think the athlete is prepared for. So in other words, they're not going to be ready. You don't have that problem, I think, because your competition that you're aiming for is 9 months away. So there is a danger that you could actually progress so slowly because you've actually got the luxury of time. It's not as though you've got to get them ready for something in September, which would be an absolute crisis. You'd really be walking a tightrope then. So I think you have to really make it in communication with the athlete. If the athlete feels that they can go harder, that they can go more quickly towards more complex skill execution, then you go that way because you're actually managing their psychology and their emotional benefits that they get from training. But in my opinion, there's no such thing as too slow physically for you because you actually have so much time that you can work towards them over 5-6 months. Yep. Because that would still give you 3 months of intense training as you transition into the more complex stuff before competition. So you do have a lot of time, and therefore I think the athlete has to drive the pace in terms of whether it's too slow, would be my advice.
All right, we did get one more question. So sorry, Ross, just one more. Are you aware of any reliable proprioception tests, specifically for ankle and shoulder?
No, I'm afraid I'm not. Sorry, Joshua. I can't help you with that one. I don't know how that's done. There are some that I know of that are not reliable. The inter-rater reliability of these tests is extremely low. There's now technology that you can use where you can do balance assessments, where you can actually measure things like sway and movement and oscillations at a much higher resolution, which might improve those. Some of them are now available through cell phones. You just have apps on phones that you use with the phone's accelerometer. So you might consider whether you use those. I put proprioception in the talk specifically because I think it is one that's very difficult to measure. And it's your experience and expertise as coaches that I think would be able to assess whether that athlete has achieved that or not, judging your own eye. And I think as long as you're systematic, that would work. Or would work sufficiently at least. So unfortunately, I'd love to give you a name, but I can't.
All right then. Okay, in that case, we've gone a bit over, but thank you all very, very much for sticking with it. Thank you, Ross, for taking the time out of your morning.
No,
It's
absolutely, yeah.
where it is,
Thank you very much.
8 in the morning in South Africa.
Yep, no worries. It was a pleasure chatting to you, and thanks for your engagement. Really enjoyed that.
Okay, great. And for everyone else, we'll we've recorded this, and so we'll, I guess, work out exactly how to use that in the future. So if you need a copy, or we'll work that out.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.